All right, good morning, and thank you for joining us here. This is the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and we are presenting Implementing Senate Bill 743 on rural areas. My name is William Walker. I'm an associate planner with the Office of Planning and Research, and we, again, would like to thank you for joining us, considering all of the different events going on. A lot of folks are still under shelter in place or safer at home orders. And we want you to know that the state of California, we are here with you, and we understand a lot of the challenges that we're all facing. But amidst that, we are happy that you can join us for this presentation, and we hope that you are safe and well with your family or with whomever you are sharing your time at this time. I want to introduce to you the team that will be working with me this morning to talk with you more about Senate Bill 743. Our Senior Advisor of Transportation, Chris Ganson, our Chief Counsel, Jeannie Lee, myself, William Walker, Special Assistant, Alyssa Montanez, and Natalie Couple is also a part of the team, and we will be with you here this morning until about noon. So I'll briefly go over the agenda. I'm hoping that we can get to the next slide. That's the team, and our agenda, just for the remainder of the series. We've already gone into our deeper dive, which is we gave some details on VMT assessment methods. That is available on our YouTube page, which is also available at our website, opr.ca.gov. If you were not able to join us last Wednesday. Again, today we'll be covering Senate Bill 743 in rural areas. We do have 4 more webinars as a part of our technical assistance efforts to local governments and jurisdictions throughout California looking for assistance on Senate Bill 743. Those topics will be on June 3rd, other land uses beyond residential, office, and retail. On Wednesday, June 10th at 10 a.m., tiering and other legal topics. And we have some open office hours for Wednesdays, June 17th and 24th. If you haven't already registered for those, you're welcome to do so at the link below. We'll also provide that information at the end of our webinar. So I would like to hand things off to Chris Ganson, our Senior Advisor for Transportation. Chris, good morning.
William, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Just want to once again want to acknowledge the unusual times we're in and the challenging times we're in, and appreciate you all joining us today to discuss implementing 743 in rural areas. So today so for those of you who attended last week, we went through a whole bunch of questions, both that we had received before during our webinar and that we received during the office hours, and just tried to answer questions about going into greater detail about the recommendations we provide for the 3 land uses, which we provide detailed recommendations: residential, office, and retail. With all those questions loaded, we moved very quickly and shared a lot of detail, mostly in one direction. Today, we're envisioning, and we'll see, this is again a new format for us, but we are aiming to create today as much more of a discussion. And so we have some information to share at the outset, but that'll only take a short amount of time, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Just as always, on a webinar online in this era, we are keeping our fingers crossed that all the technology works well. We understand that it generally the average track record is 85 or 90% success rate in this software, meaning the things don't fall offline or go wrong. We managed to get our technology together more smoothly today than we have, given the practice we've had in the previous webinars and the office hour last week. And we ask your permission as we are learning these formats as well and kind of pioneering these formats. We hope that this is this session, this couple of hours, provides a great way for people to get questions answered and for other people to listen in on the discussion and the answers to those questions, and thereby share information more widely and more efficiently. Okay, so I'll work my way through the slides. Feel free if you have questions or if there is a project that you have questions about to write a description into the question and answer. And then in a little while, when we have talked through a few of the basics, we'll have some discussion, some fodder for discussion. Okay. Oops, getting ahead of myself. Just want to first start with pointing out that there are a number of resources available for rural smart growth, rural VMT reduction, from the policy to the planning, zoning, et cetera. And some of those are on our website, which we'll show you at the end, but you can also navigate to OPR's website, and within that, under CEQA, the SB 743 website. And just want to share some thinking about how implementation of 743 will work in California's rural areas. So we really see that 743 will support the rural landscape insofar as we're shifting away from the metric LOS, automobile level of service standards. And LOS tends to yield wider roads, more automobile capacity, more space for automobiles at the expense of not only pedestrian comfort and safety, and often cyclist comfort and safety, and environmental factors, and in more urban areas, often the ability for, talked through this in the webinar, there's research that shows that LOS doesn't actually help lead to better access to destinations, the kind of underlying point of transportation. But in rural areas, all that focus on the automobile can often be counterproductive in keeping rural character. In other words, giving space over to cars doesn't tend to add to small town charm, for example, or rural character more generally. Because 743 streamlines infill development, including in rural areas, it can really help existing places thrive and regenerate, and also create great new places rather than new places that feel like suburbia or exurbia, another cookie cutter development, something that has a better feel to it and supports community, in some cases walkability, but again, rural character in a better way than what we had before. So one point that's important to acknowledge at the outset is that rural is a lot of different things. When you say rural, when you say urban, we all kind of have a sense of what that is, and suburban. Rural, however, can be one of very different things. So just wanted to put up from one of the resources we have on our website from the Smart Growth Network. This is how they divvy up rural, just kind of giving an example. Gateway communities, resource-dependent communities might be, even those might look very different from one another. A logging town versus a farm worker settlement or community. Edge communities, we're going to be not talking about edge communities as much today, because edge communities means the edge of an urban area. And for 743 purposes, rural development is rural county development, those counties that are non-MPO counties. And so edge communities are largely dealt with by the same approaches that we use for urban areas. Traditional main streets, another sort of rural type area or zone, and actually one that performs quite well for VMT just on the natural, and second home and retirement communities. So that's one way to slice the pie. Here's another one. This is from a paper, Transportation Research Board paper on VMT reduction in rural areas. You can also think of it in this more simple manner, productive rural. Again, examples are agriculture and forestry can be productive. Destination, so vacation locations, for example, and edge, which again, we are mostly including in urban in terms of approach from 743's perspective. So just want to acknowledge that the vastly different flavors of rural, and it's because there's such vastly different flavors in rural that we recommend in our technical advisory, we recommend for the vast majority of the state some approaches, some methods, and some thresholds, significance thresholds. And in rural areas, we acknowledge that because things are so different, or let me say one more thing about the urban areas. We recommend relating your VMT in an MPO area to the regional VMT, to the regional average, or in some cases the city average. So tuning it to, and we believe strongly that that's appropriate for MPO areas. But we acknowledge that more flexibility is needed because of these kind of vastly different rural characters and contexts and situations or projects, context for projects. Okay, so just wanted to talk through briefly just a sampling of mitigation measures that can be used in rural areas. And for any project, any given project, you could certainly look at this list and several or maybe even most of the individual mitigation measures and say that couldn't possibly apply to my project. Fine, true, like you're going to pick the mitigation measures that are appropriate for your project. I mean, there are going to be, there are going to be a lot of overlap and similarity to the mitigation measures you might have chosen for your greenhouse gas mitigation, or for your energy mitigation, and perhaps for other air quality mitigation, or for other impacts. There's a lot of overlap. So a lot of this is not that new, but just wanted to point out that there are an array of mitigation options. I'll just kind of briefly walk through a few of these. Active transportation infrastructure. A lot of rural areas have been putting in bikeways and pedestrian ways. It can be on the larger scale, but it can also be on the smaller scale on a small town main street. Street patterns that facilitate connectivity, so grid and connectivity. Those are shown in the research to reduce vehicle travel because people can get to where they're going more directly. Clustering development near the center. This is, of course, not possible for some rural development. A winery is not going to cluster with other wineries because there has to be space for all those grapes to grow, and would do something else. But a housing development, it might make sense to cluster that near the town center. Providing affordable and workforce housing is certainly important where affordability is an issue and can save long in commutes by workers. This is particularly true, perhaps, in well, this is true in a lot of contexts, but one where it's true is in a resort town, for example, where workers might be priced out if affordable housing isn't consciously provided for and built, and that can tend to be very low, providing that can actually be VMT reducing. Mobility as a service is the name in transportation we have for kind of app-based transportation options. So you pull up an app and says, okay, you can drive to this location in this amount of time. You could also take this regional bus or paratransit or another option. In some cases, of course, many not, but in some cases, and even in rural areas, micromobility might be an option. But the idea of a mobility as a service is it provides all of your mobility options in one place, and so you can make a best choice there. Shuttles in many contexts are helpful. Back to that winery example, so you might not be able to move all the wineries close to one another, but you could put a shuttle that runs between them, which would reduce VMT and also help people not need to drive after they've had tasted done a wine tasting or two. Van pools are essentially usually for commute, and there's a lot of examples of van pools already in existence in, for example, the Central Valley for farm worker transportation, but also elsewhere in the state. Providing for telecommuting, including providing good broadband service, is a useful approach to reducing VMT. Mixing uses, so providing, just like it is in urban areas, that mixing may be less intensive. You might have, instead of 4 stories over retail, you might have a development that has single family houses. You might have 4 stories over retail. There are some rural areas that would support that. Others, you might imagine development, instead of being a monoculture of single family homes, having single family homes with some nearby retail, so that people don't have to necessarily get in their car to go shopping, or if they do, they're taking a shorter trip to retail that's right there in the area. And then, providing, you can also add good walking and biking paths to facilitate active transportation, which reduces vehicle travel, also helps people stay healthy. And providing car sharing in some contexts is useful. Facilitating pooling can be, where there are enough people going the same ways. And there are new app-based approaches for doing that. Land preservation can help prevent a small town from sprawling and remain lower in VMT. Providing busing or pooling for schools, for school children to get to schools. Bike parking, where biking is a good, reasonable mode option. Deploying your infrastructure, investing in infrastructure in a strategic fashion, so as not to lead to kind of town sprawl or rural sprawl, but to keep the city more compact, walkable, community friendly, in rural character, etc. Wayfinding for cyclists and pedestrians. In many rural contexts, there is some transit available, and it makes sense to, in some cases, it may make sense to provide or subsidize transit passes, or subsidize connections of transit connections to a new development that's being built, to orient, and it may make sense, especially if there is a transit hub or a transit station, to orient the development to it, and or provide bike and ped access to transit stops or hubs. Focus development around the transit hub similarly. Bike share and rental stations, bulb outs and other walkability enhancements for pedestrian comfort and safety. And in some cases, where there's parking pressure, unbundling parking, so that residents can choose whether or not to pay for a parking space. Okay, just a reminder, and this is kind of basic CEQA, but it's important here, that you can consider 3 different kinds of projects in CEQA in general and including under 743. You could slice it this way, where projects will be low VMT naturally. So this surprises a lot of people, the extent to which a lot of rural projects are low in VMT, particularly in towns and cities which are not commuter suburbs. Tend to have very low VMT just on the natural. So a lot of projects in those areas will find themselves just simply streamlined. There's other projects that will have a significant impact, will generate VMT higher than whatever threshold is chosen, and will be able to apply mitigation to reduce VMT to less than significant. And there'll be those projects which will be high VMT and will be above the threshold you choose. And you'll be able to do some mitigation, but you won't be able to mitigate to less than significant. You can proceed with those projects with a statement of overriding considerations. The VMT reduction from those streamlined projects, from getting more low VMT projects, combined with the VMT mitigation, the reduction in VMT from projects 2 and 3, will help us achieve a lot of our state goals in California around health, environment, greenhouse gas emissions, reduction in the amount we grow our greenhouse gas emissions, or actually reduction in the emissions, for absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And so with that, with those thoughts, just want to open up for questions. Specific questions, of course, are fine. And if you want to, if you have a project in mind, either conceptual or real, and would like to put it in front of us and discuss, please feel free to do so as well. So I'll pause here and I'll have a look over the question and answer, and also Will may have been able to have a look at some of them. And if he sees questions that look good, he can put them to us, and I'll also be taking a look. You can also upvote questions if you see a question that would provide, you think the answer to that might provide you some information you want. Please feel free to push those questions up to the top so we can take the ones. Hopefully we can get through all of them. There's a good chance we won't be able to, and then we can get to the ones that will help the most people. All right.
I think we do have a few questions, and I do want to remind folks that the Q&A function is open. We do have 7 questions pending. We've got some upvoted. And for folks who joined us late, this is all being streamed to YouTube, so you'll be able to catch whatever you missed. I wanted to just start with 2 general questions because they're somewhat related. How do you quantify the reduction of rural VMT mitigation measures? Talks about CAPCOA citing little evidence that these measures work in rural areas. And as a follow-up, are these benefits related to using VMT as a metric in rural areas, or are the actual project-related mitigation measures?
Project-related mitigation measures.
Are they? I'm sorry. Are these actually mitigation measures? So.
Got it. I'm gonna give that a shot, and I might go back to the question. Who has asked that question, just so I can pull it in front of me?
Sure. So the first part of the question was from Laura Fornash.
Got it.
How do you quantify the reduction of VMT?
Yeah.
And the second part was from Destiny Preston.
Great. So there are applications of, just to go with Laura's question first, there are applications of CAPCOA's work. Yes, there are mitigation measures that will work in urban areas and not in rural areas. CAPCOA does provide some guidance on how to assess VMT reduction in rural areas. Now, you don't need to constrain yourself to CAPCOA. There's certainly already projects, including projects in a rural destination that I'm familiar with, that are going above and beyond CAPCOA, the research that CAPCOA provides, and quantifying much deeper reductions. In that particular place, the example I'm thinking of is in the Tahoe area, and it's a place that's parking constrained, and reducing parking is going to have a big effect on VMT. So it's difficult to answer in the abstract or general where to go for mitigation measures. CAPCO is certainly one place. It certainly also doesn't have all the answers. And further, as we go forward, there's quickly going to be more examples in research. Some of the cities in urban areas that have already shifted to VMT have some kind of rural-ish places within them. I'm thinking of the city of San Jose in particular, and what they've done with 743 in the Coyote Valley. So that might also be a good place to look. Okay, I'm going to get to.
Before you get to that, CAPCOA, California Air Pollution Control Officers Association.
Yes, and you can find the CAPCOA's. It's called their greenhouse. I'm going to forget the full name of the title, which I think I did in the last office hours as well. The greenhouse gas emissions mitigation quantification guidance. It's I'm not quite getting the name right. It's on our website though. You can pull it down under the in the key resources area. You can find it there.
It's called Quantifying Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Measures.
Thank you. And it's the title is greenhouse gases, but the transportation measures in it are quantified in terms of VMT, and then apply a greenhouse gas multiplier to the VMT. So you can pull the researches directly on VMT. So those are just a few places to look. There's you can also go straight to the academic research and use that directly to assess how effective a given mitigation measure would be. Okay, sorry, Will, you there were some other parts to that question.
I just dismissed it. I think you hit on it when you were talking about Coyote Valley, but like some of the measures that you listed, are they actually VMT reduction measures, or is there actual evidence that they reduce VMT?
So there will be, again, this is the variation in rural locations. There are many that will reduce VMT, and for a certain project, some of them won't be reasonable or applicable or VMT reducing, but that's just it's not a full menu, but it's just a smattering of examples that I put up on the screen. And many of them, so I'll say one more thing about mitigation since we're discussing it. In rural areas, even more often, in urban areas, this often makes sense. In rural areas, I think it even more often makes sense to sometimes band together with other projects or do mitigation at the more at the planning level. So I'll go back to the example of the shuttle for their wineries. So a winery might put in a shuttle that goes from a nearby, I can imagine a train stop in Napa, or a shuttle that just goes from a town center where people are staying in their hotels to the winery. But that's going to work a lot better, probably, if it's several wineries going in on a shuttle through the locale, because it's more efficient to shuttle people to a number of locations. So a lead agency or a jurisdiction might choose to provide kind of a framework for new projects to contribute to a shuttle service and have them band together in that sort of way. So that sort of plan level or work together over a number of projects becomes it's not the only pathway, but it becomes a more important pathway in rural areas.
All right. Are you ready for your next question, sir?
Please.
All right. So from Lee Kamrick, and it's been upvoted by 3 of our participants, how does VMT allow for road widening and extra lane projects to provide emergency response and protect lives during an evacuation? For example, during a wildfire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question.
And does VMT preclude public safety projects such as ingress and egress routes?
So the basic answer is no. I'm going to talk through this a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is that for roadway projects, and I'm not focusing too much on roadway projects today because I want to circle back, and Caltrans is developing guidance on this and they're holding webinars on it. But I also want to answer this this question. So for when you add roadway capacity that's not relieving congestion, present congestion or future congestion, it doesn't have an induced travel effect. The mechanism by which induced travel occurs, by which the VMT effects of a roadway project occur, are by relieving congestion, by speeding up people's trips temporarily until the induced travel tends to recongest those facilities. In a rural area that where congestion is not an issue, then adding extra capacity is not going to have that, simply not going to have that effect. So there wouldn't be a VMT impact for those sorts of projects. Now, how will 743 help? 743 is not particularly going to help or hurt evacuation planning. Evacuation planning needs to be done independent of 743. What 743 will do is help development be provided in a more clustered, and it essentially, I mean, it doesn't do this overtly, but it streamlines projects that are more close to one another, projects that are less extended out into our state's forests and rural lands where wildfire is a real risk. So 743 really works in conjunction with and dovetails with our advice and kind of this new paradigm we're facing due to climate change, that, you know, there's these severe wildfire risks, and those tend to be in high VMT areas. So 743 will help deliver a rural development fabric, built environment, which is more resilient to wildfire than some of the development patterns we've done over the past years. For emergency services generally, there is actually research, and I believe we have it up on our website. It's actually, you know, I know where it is. It's contained in the General Plan Guidelines Appendix B, which focuses on safety and has a lot of connection to CEQA. There's research showing that that low VMT development, more compact development, is more effectively served, quicker served by emergency services, because the distance that an emergency vehicle has to go matters. Congestion matters some as well, but less, because emergency vehicles can get around congestion using their sirens to a great extent, even if not completely at full speed. And meanwhile, it's very difficult for emergency services, including fire, but all emergency services, to serve extremely spread out areas. They do a poor job, and that there's clear research that leads to greater worse injury and greater fatality rates because of the worse accessibility of those spread out areas to emergency services. So yeah, let's go on to the next one, Will. But I wanted to answer that one.
Great. So, and just to remind folks, you can ask your questions at the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A icon with 2 chat bubbles. We have 14 questions on queue. Our next question: many rural counties have town centers where jobs and services are available to residents in the surrounding area. What is the best approach to develop VMT thresholds with these town centers in mind? And what tools are available to rural counties to develop these thresholds?
So one tool we're going to be providing in the next, in about a month, July 1, we're expecting to roll this out, is a tool called Site Check. So you can look and see whether any location, you'll be able to look and see whether any location in the state, one, has CEQA exemptions available, and also it'll show the existing the VMT of that site, kind of that neighborhood, if you will. That's going to be for urban and rural areas. So that will help with, at a minimum, the streamlining approach. And there are, again, a lot of rural, particularly small town areas, Main Street sort of areas, that will find themselves simply streamlined. Now, there may be cases where the information we provide will be a little bit too coarse, but there's going to be other approaches to, we're seeing what data we can gather to provide to show that by too coarse, I mean that the pixels will be too big. So main streets or small towns might get lumped together with surrounding areas and not show the true reduction of VMT of that locale. But we're also working with other data sources to try and bring those in, and other data sources are available to you all. Anything from county models to big data, travel surveys, etc. So let's see the question, to dig into the question here. What's the best approach to develop VMT thresholds? We don't provide direct guidance. We actually specifically don't provide direct guidance on developing rural VMT thresholds as we do for urban. In urban areas, we suggest you should definitely connect those thresholds to state climate goals. That is one option for rural areas, but it's I would say it's fairly context dependent, and you'll need to think about the context of the rural area in which your project is going to go. Let's see, tools available to rural counties to develop thresholds. Right, I already talked about that.
You talked about tools. I think a good way to round this out is that when you're looking at a town center in a rural area, it's acting like an urban area in some ways. Like it's an agglomeration of different uses. So if it's a town center that has transportation, maybe looking at ways to supplement that, offering discounts for riding transportation to and from, expanding dial a ride or demand response type transit. And I know that we're not to necessarily give guidance, but I think that being able to see the town center being kind of an urban context.
Those are some mitigation measures that may work in some town centers. Now, a rural jurisdiction, a rural county, for example, or a small town might want to take the approach. I mean, you could just start with where we recommended for urban areas in a main street or town. That could work very well for you, and in fact is likely to lead to a lot of streamlining for small town infill or clustered development, connected to the town rather than kind of disconnected and outside of it. So that'd be a starting point, but I don't want to constrain. Well, I don't want to constrain the threshold conversation for rural overall. It's gonna need to be approached in many cases, case by case.
Great. All right, we have another question. The substantial evidence provided in the OPR technical advisory for the recommended thresholds of significance is rooted in the scoping plan and greenhouse gas emission reductions. Additionally, OPR has noted that in rural areas of non-MPO counties, that significance thresholds may be best determined on a case-by-case basis. Please speak to the substantial evidence under CEQA that OPR recommends basing these case-by-case significance thresholds that will meet the intent of SB 743 and be most defensible if challenged.
Sure. So for urban contexts, OPR recommends, and I'm going to caveat this with that OPR doesn't provide legal advice. Jeannie Lee, our chief counsel, may chime in here and there today to give some general advice, but we can't give actual legal advice. So in the urban areas, the general, the kind of overarching transportation pattern is of there are centers that people frequently travel to for work. They get a lot of commute travel, and then there are, of course, residences in those centers. There's suburbs around them, oftentimes outer suburbs and exurbs. And that's kind of a fairly consistent context across urban California. And we, in view of that and in light of that, we recommend connecting thresholds to state climate goals. And we've recommended a fairly detailed method on how to do that, as you point out. That sort of pattern is not the case in rural counties, in most rural counties. It is to some extent in those situations, as I was just describing, in a small town or even a mid-sized city, a small to mid-sized city in a rural area. Maybe it is appropriate to use that. That would be one place to turn. But we recognize that the contexts in these rural areas are different enough that that sort of framework won't make sense. And we can't say this is the other framework that makes sense in rural areas, because rural areas are varied enough that there isn't one particular framework we can recommend for all rural areas.
And
at the end, oh, go ahead, chime in.
I'll just add that we understand that agencies do struggle with this question, and I always just try to turn back to the definition of substantial evidence in the CEQA guidelines, section 15384, and it says that it's enough relevant information and reasonable inferences that a fair argument can be made to support the conclusion. And then, so we look at basically the entire record to build the substantial evidence to support your conclusion. And so, as Chris said, every project is different in rural areas and just across the state. So it's difficult for us to say that this one thing is going to be the thing. And if you do this, this is going to be the most defensible path for you. So it's difficult for us to say that, but we hope that we can provide at least some kind of from guidelines.
And I'll add that, considering impacts under CEQA, more guidance has been shared and more thought has been into, and more substantial evidence has been amassed for VMT, certainly in urban areas, than probably any other impact category under CEQA. So we heard concerns as we were developing our materials in 743 and our recommendations. We heard your and other concerns that this is a new approach. We want to provide guidance, and so there's quite a bit more detailed guidance than for any other from the state than any other facet of CEQA for urban areas. So I just want to put this question in the context of that. This is a lot more in rural areas. We are by necessity, because of their variation, leaving it a little more open-ended as for all the rest of the impact categories in CEQA, or many of the other impact categories in CEQA, because that flexibility, we think, is more important in these contexts. Okay, let's go on to the next question.
All right, our next question. We only have one retail development over 50,000 square feet. So using that as a definition for locally serving retail would give basically all retail projects a free pass. Do you have any guidance on alternative definitions?
Right. So the 50,000 square foot number is our recommendation for kind of a backstop on. We recommend, if you have a project over 50,000 square that includes let me be specific, that includes a store or a single space that's over 50,000 square feet, that you not assume it's locally serving, that you do the analysis to see whether it, so you might you might apply a screening criteria that we recommend of locally serving retail is presumed less than significant. That's important context for folks who, for other folks on the viewing this office hours. And so we recommend not doing that, not holding that presumption of less than significant impact for developments, including stores over 50,000 square feet. So it's not that we're defining development under 50,000 square feet as locally serving. We're saying if you're over 50,000 square feet, we certainly suggest you should not presume it's locally serving, and you should do the study. So it's the 50,000 is whether or not it's just streamlined, no need to do the analysis at all. Let's see, the question here is that using that definition for locally serving retail would give us basically all retail projects a free pass. So one thing I would point out is that in many circumstances, certainly for infill retail in rural areas, not all circumstances, but many circumstances, retail is actually going to reduce VMT because retail, like a grocery store, put in a rural area will very frequently provide people a closer place to shop. If it's a small grocery store or even a supermarket, the only example that probably wouldn't is a large grocery store or big box type store, which would shift people's shopping patterns from more local shopping to further away. So those are the kinds of projects which you would need to analyze. As far as definitions, again, it's lead agency prerogative to make a decision on what to consider locally serving and what would be VMT reducing. But it would seem pretty reasonable to provide substantial evidence. It would seem pretty doable to show that a lot of retail development in rural areas, particularly again, that which is not going to attract people to go past other shopping opportunities and to this distant one, is gonna reduce VMT and not have a transportation impact under 743.
All right. Is there a rural TDM guidance that you would recommend for rural areas?
So we have a couple resources on our website, 743 website. So I'd recommend looking at those. There's one paper. It's kind of a literature review. It's a Transportation Research Board paper, Miller et al. And that lists rural VMT reducing measures and lists the studies from which those are drawn. So you can, that's a good resource, but there are a number of resources out there. I wouldn't say I'm not familiar with guidance per se, but there are resources out there for rural VMT reduction. Thanks, Will.
Sure. If a county is in an MPO, but is primarily rural, can't the county assess VMT in its rural areas consistent with the rural guidance? If not, why does the MPO status change the VMT analysis in the rural areas?
Yeah, so our technical advisory suggests that MPO areas follow the guidance that we give generally for the rest of the state, the non-rural counties. And that is, as you're probably aware, the 15% below regional average or city average for residential, and 15% below regional average per employee, or VMT per employee, 15% below regional average for office projects. So the MPOs were established as basically having large enough cities that there was that kind of magnetic central draw where people might commute into those areas, and that the and that so considering them through that lens, that the methods and thresholds that we recommend is generally a fit. Now, there are some parts of MPO counties, that have rural areas in them. And the thing is that this is a little bit difficult to define. So it might be rural in character now, but if you develop that subdivision there, you have a commuter suburb, which needs to be thought of through the lens that we recommend be thought through, examined through the lens and through using the methods and thresholds we have in the technical advisory. We are working with Caltrans to see if there is a better way to define, to carve out some areas that we can be sure will remain truly rural in MPO counties and provide some additional guidance. We don't have that yet, but we are looking into it and seeing whether that makes sense. Now, I'll say that it's a difficult task to draw that line, particularly when we don't know, it may well be in 5 or 10 years, people have access to automated vehicles, which may greatly expand the range of commuting, right? And allow what may have looked like truly rural far enough away not to be a commute suburb, change that into something that is within commute range. We know that people may have a lot more willingness to go further distances to a job when they don't have to drive their car or just ride in it. So we have to be cognizant of that. Now, we don't recommend, just to be clear, we don't recommend that, we think it's a little bit speculative at this point within CEQA to be factoring in directly automated vehicle VMT. So we don't recommend necessarily trying to do that in your VMT analyses. Just want to be clear about that. But we do need to consider from a policy perspective our recommendations on what sorts of methods to use where, that those that way of getting around might be available well within the life of projects. And so we need to consider that in our recommendations. So that's just a where we are on that, and why we are where we are so far and what we're looking at next as far as possible adjustments. Oh, Will, I think you're muted. And I'm not good at reading lips.
My bad.
There we go.
I was trying to mute the freeway noise, the VMT outside my window. So we are approaching the halfway point of our Office Hours presentation for May 27th on rural areas. My name is William Walker, and you've been listening to Chris Ganson and Jeannie Lee. We're all on the OPR planning and community development team, Office of Planning and Research with the Governor's Office. And we're going to be going for another hour. We have about 17 questions in queue. You're welcome to go to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A chat bubbles and upvote anything that you'd like to see answered sooner rather than later, in case you have to run to another meeting. And this information will all be stored to our OPR website and our YouTube channel. So I just wanted to do a little housekeeping there. Are you ready for your next question, Chris?
Yes, and let me just add before that, you can find the recording of this on our YouTube channel. If you go to OPR's main website, there's a little YouTube in the kind of upper left, towards the upper left corner, a little YouTube icon. Click on that, that'll get you to our YouTube channel and the recording of are the webinars we held. Because we haven't gotten our technical ducks in a complete row. You see a lot of like us setting up the webinar at the beginning. Just fast forward yourself. Sorry about that. So for our webinars are recorded. Our last week office hours is recorded, and this office hour assuming that we get the technology right, which I think we're pretty good on because Will's on this. We'll have
And Alyssa.
And Alyssa, thank you. Yeah. Let me forget Alyssa's been an enormous help in this. That we should have that recorded as well. Again, find it on our YouTube channel, which is accessible from that icon on our 743 webpage. Okay, Will, let's go for another question.
Great. So our next question is, many rural counties do not have regional travel demand models and lack VMT metrics, average VMT or per capita average VMT per employee, for example of those metrics. The statewide model provides some TAZ level VMT data, but not countywide averages. What would applicable VMT significance thresholds be in these locations?
So again, we don't have for rural counties recommendations. We pulled back from offering recommendations on significance thresholds, but you may well, I think in a lot of cases, will want to look at the regional average and base your threshold off of that in some way or form. We are working, so there's the travel demand models in those areas, which I think oftentimes should be able to yield VMT metrics. In cases where they can't, I think just as of last night, I had a conversation with someone at Streetlight, an email conversation, and I think that we are going to be able to get data from there. It isn't nailed down yet. So big data, essentially, cell phone data, and aggregated and privacy cleaned cell phone data, just for anyone with concerns about that. And that I believe we will be able to supply county averages, county VMT per capita and county VMT per employee, and have some mapping of that again for streamlining, but for use in thresholds, and you'll be able to pivot from those. So I can't say what applicable VMT significance thresholds would be. I could tell you about the recommendations that we have in the technical advisory. You could review the webinar from a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago for that. But we don't provide recommendations because we're doing the opposite. We're providing flexibility on those in our recommendations on those significance thresholds. So I hope that's helpful. I guess I would add also that for studying project level VMT, this is not squarely asked in the question, but I think others might be wondering, if the travel demand model isn't available or appropriate for studying that project, sketch models like CaliMod or other similar sketch models can be used. And those are oftentimes better models for some projects in any case.
Great. So our next question is, do you think cities that have adopted thresholds less than 15%, like Corona or San Bernardino, have provided substantial evidence for those thresholds? They cite limitations of TDM options because of their rural or suburban settings.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question really for urban areas. I'm trying to, I'm going to take a peek, or maybe somebody else can from OPR on the line. I'm not familiar with Corona, and I don't know what county it's in, whether it's in an MPO.
What is Riverside County?
Riverside County. Okay, great. So it's part of SCAG. So both of these in our guidance are considered urban. I'm familiar with San Bernardino, having been there, and I wouldn't consider that rural either, as it's certainly not in a non-MPO county, and it's part of a metropolitan area it's not it's a city, it's not a rural area. I don't know by which definition it would be considered. I can't think of a definition by which it would be considered rural. But
The only thing close to San Bernardino that would be rural would be like the fringe of Ontario and Fontana, which are on the border of this part of Corona, of Riverside County. But I mean, it's clearly also logistics stuff out there. It's not all rural.
right, and the question that I would ask, so I'm just, again, according to our existing guidance, if you're in an MPO, we're not recommending taking that flexibility. We're recommending using the methods and recommendations we provide. Now we may, as I said, also revisit that, but without full familiarity of at least the second city here listed, the first Corona, I'm not positive, but I don't think that those cities would be something that we would provide recommendations on designating rural. So taking them as urban or parts of an urban region, our recommendations, yes, are 15%. We recommend that 15% below regional average or city average. That's another factor, is that even within urban areas, the city can look at the regional average for residential projects, but it can also look at its own average. So there's a threshold tailored to the individual city, and providing streamlining even in low VMT areas in its more travel efficient areas. So we would recommend that those areas, yes, use the 15% below city or regional average for residential VMT per capita, 15% below regional VMT per capita for employment projects. And I guess the concern, again, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not providing legal advice, but CEQA requires a focus on the impact, not a focus on the I'll just leave it at that. CEQA requires a focus on the impact, and our state climate goals are very real and embedded in state law. And so our concern would be that if you used a less environmentally protective threshold, that it would be possible for somebody to carry the substantial evidence that's now quite easily available that is not connected or disconnected or not in line with state climate goals, and show that actually is a significant impact. So that would be our concern about using that approach. Okay, let's go on.
Okay. When updating cities' transportation impact analysis guidelines to incorporate VMT, is there such a thing as cumulative VMT scenarios as for LOS? All the guidance for VMT seems to focus on reduction versus existing VMT, but the question was raised by a city staff member I'm working with.
Right, so there's a lot of CEQA tradition of looking at an impact compared to existing. And there's a shift happening within CEQA, and its case law gives it the thumbs up, that we look at efficiency metrics, by which I mean the case law is on greenhouse gases, but it's very similar for VMT, GHG per capita, or VMT per capita, or VMT per employee. First, when you're measuring, when your metric is VMT per capita for residential project, for example, and you have existing VMT per capita, and you have a new project that has its VMT per capita, you can't add those together. There's no cumulative VMT per capita. It just doesn't make any sense. So essentially, if what we put forth, and this is actually in the technical advisory, what we put forth is that if you have a less than significant impact, or you mitigate to a less than significant impact, or whatever amount of impact you have at the project level, is also covers your cumulative analysis. That's the only way that makes sense with an efficiency metric. Again, a metric with the denominator in it. So you'll run into people who have been practicing in CEQA for a long time and will ask, well, what's the cumulative analysis in this? And the answer for office projects and residential projects and any other project you're using an efficiency metric, metric with a denominator, that the cumulative and the project are the same analysis.
And Chris, I'll just reiterate what you said. Basically that in this new world of VMT, it's not, the cumulative impact analysis is not additive as we saw with LOS, not in a situation where you're using an efficiency metric. So it's probably best to set your cumulative threshold to be in line with the long-term goals. And so as Chris said, then the long-term goals encompass that cumulative analysis.
Right, and that's what you've done if you followed our recommendations in urban areas. But you can look at other sort of cumulative goals, or you can look back at those same cumulative goals if you choose in rural areas. All right, let's go on to the
Before we go to the next question, I want to let folks know that they should be upvoting if at all possible questions that you'd like to hear. We've got 19 questions and we have just under 50 minutes. So just want to try to prioritize questions that folks would really like to hear. Our next question, are there any studies or data showing how effective each of these mitigation measures can be in the rural context? Since the analysis oftentimes is quantitative, how do agencies pick and support which mitigations can be used?
Right, thanks. And I spoke to this a little bit, but I'm glad the question came back up. So again, in some cases, you'll be able to look at research on a mitigation measure and apply it to your area. In some cases, the context will be so important that the research done in one context will not, even one rural context won't carry over to another rural context. So really you have to look mitigation measure by mitigation measure as to just like you would anywhere to some extent, to see how it would apply and to what effect it would have. Again, CAPCOA provides some guidance on doing that. You can go straight to academic studies or other sources. I didn't mention before, but actually also I should note that CAPCOA is in the process of revising its guidance on mitigation, the greenhouse gas quantification guidance we spoke of earlier. And I don't know the timeline on that, but I know they're trying to do it relatively quickly. So we should have updated essentially, it's just essentially a big literature review with some guidance on how to apply the literature to projects. In any case, that should be updated in the coming months.
All right, our next question. For edge communities, realistic implementation of TDMs as listed by CAPCOA are being estimated to be less than the 15% maximum reduction. What other rural edge TDM guidance studies can you recommend to supplement CAPCOA?
Let's see, rural edge. So I guess the questioner is asking about kind of edge development around the edge of an urban region, which is sometimes considered rural, and we generally don't consider rural in our recommendations. We consider it part of the urban area, because edge implies edge of something. So we don't have, I don't have any particular studies at my fingertips on edge development mitigation. There may, in fact, be times where you can't mitigate to less than significant. Perhaps it's not feasible to include, the development is, for some reason, it's not feasible to include retail development that allows people to do their shopping locally. or the street connectivity you provide helps some, mitigate some, but doesn't mitigate fully, down to less than significant. We do anticipate, just like for any other impact in CEQA, there will be times where there's a significant and unavoidable impact, and CEQA has a way to deal with that called a statement of overriding considerations. So you can go forward to the project mitigating as feasible, and then write a statement of overriding considerations that it's worth building the project despite its significant environmental impacts. The lead agency signs off on that, and the project can go forward.
All right, our next question. Can you define region? Can you use a council of governments?
Yeah, so we mean, by region, we mean MPO. And if that's a multi-county MPO, we mean all the counties together. If it's a single county MPO, we mean just that county. And in non-MPO counties, we mean just the county when we say region.
And a MPO, for folks who aren't following along, is a metropolitan planning organization, correct?
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Can you please provide any leads on VMT modeling software that has data available for rural communities? We currently use CalEMod, but their VMT data is for urban areas.
I may have misunderstood, but I thought that CalEMod has some, it's based on the CAPCOA greenhouse gas emissions quantification guidance, which does have some measures that speak to rural areas. And I believe that CalEMod draws in that data. I could be wrong about that. In any case, I don't, VMT modeling software is one place to look. You don't need to use a VMT modeling software package. In some cases, the travel demand model will be the right model to use. In other cases, it won't be the right model to use. But I know that the Environmental Protection Agency and Fair and Peers developed an MXD model, which I believe has some applicability in different locations. That might be a place to look as well. Again, CEQA allows the lead agency to choose the model that you feel is best for the application. So we don't provide specific guidance on which model to use, but there's some thoughts to follow.
All right, our next question is, let me reread this. Would the addition of auxiliary lanes be considered a VMT inducing project? And I'm assuming that that's auxiliary lanes on a freeway project.
Yeah, I would make the same assumption. So that depends. I'm assuming that the auxiliary lanes were added in order to relieve congestion. And if they were, then there would be an induced travel effect. And it might be significant if the auxiliary lane was if it was just a short auxiliary lane, it might not be at enough to have any measurable effect. But if it was a long auxiliary lane, then it might. But I'm trying to think of in what rural. I guess there would be some rural locations that might include auxiliary lanes. So yeah, those could have an induced travel effect and therefore an effect on VMT. Again, where there's not congestion existing or congestion projected, in other words, the auxiliary lane is not going to have any effect on congestion, then no, there wouldn't be any induced travel effect. So there wouldn't be a measurable effect on VMT.
Our next question is, larger cities are better positioned for actually meeting a 15% BMT reduction goal because of shared mobility, transit, etc. The question is, does OPR recommend a suburban city adopt 15% with the understanding that the project will likely not meet it and either SOCs are required or set a realistic threshold that is less than 15%.
Right. So first, the 15%, remember that the 15% is of 15% reduction from regional or city VMT per capita for residential. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think I would disagree with the premise that that level, that significance threshold, is not tailored to that jurisdiction. It's directly tailored to it. It's based on that jurisdiction's average. So if that jurisdiction has a higher average, that the absolute number of that threshold is going to be quite a bit higher and quite a bit more permissive. So this was important, obviously, in looking at the state and the variation we have, and coming up with an approach that would lead to a statewide consistency with our climate goals. Statewide consistency with our climate goals isn't that everybody's VMT has to be San Francisco's VMT. It's that everybody pitch in and do, every lead agency pitch in and do their share. So this is not a, I guess this is not a rural question, but I'm going to seek to answer it anyway. So we are looking at the substantial evidence that we believe indicates a significant impact on the environment. We're not developing the thresholds around feasibility per se, but we do believe that in suburban areas, really the majority of suburban areas, there should be mitigation available to reduce VMT by 15%. So certainly no, to answer that question, I think directly, we're not aiming for suburban development to need to write statements of already consideration. We're aiming for suburban development to provide VMT mitigation where it's high in VMT, and do its part in enabling us to reach our climate goals, as well as all of the, create all the air quality, other environmental and health benefits that come along with VMT reduction and lower VMT development.
All right, our next question is, if a commercial development project is made up of many retail spaces, all under 50,000 square feet, would that qualify to be screened out? Or should you look at the square footage of the project in aggregate?
So our recommendation is to look at the largest store within the retail development. But remember that this is a backstop, simply a backstop. It's what we recommend. If you're above 50,000 square feet, we suggest that you not use the streamlining, the retail streamlining, and that skips the analysis altogether. That you actually go and do the analysis, see whether the project is going to increase or decrease VMT. For a little context here, just in case folks haven't seen the webinar or read the technical advisory, for retail development, we recommend looking at the vehicle travel in the area and then seeing what it is with the project. Did the project make people's shopping patterns less efficient? Did people start to drive more with the project to do their shopping? Or did it enable them to do less driving to do their shopping? And so if VMT goes up, we recommend a significant impact. And that's our recommendation again for urban areas, but for rural areas, very often, except for those projects which draw people again past existing stores and further to these new region serving or area serving retail, that might increase VMT, but a lot of retail development is going to actually reduce VMT by providing closer options for shopping.
All right, next question. Using CalEMod for VMT modeling would result in a regional average trip being applied. Therefore, if you were trying to achieve the 15% reduction per capita resident, etc., wouldn't using CalEMod
there is a jump down one.
Wouldn't using CalEMod to model VMT result in every project having to be reviewed in an EIR if not screened out. Yes, it did jump down.
Well, could you leave this and actually questions, if you could just leave them up here, because sometimes I read part of them and then lose myself in answering part of them, and there's another part that I want to get back to. So if you don't mind, just leaving it up until we go on to the next one, or maybe that's Alyssa, I'm not sure. But so I'm
So that one's still there. It just jumped down. So
yeah,
it's
no,
the
I
second
thought, yeah, it just reminded me that I got concerned that I wouldn't be able to look back at this one because it has a couple pieces to it.
one. Right.
So thanks. So I'm not sure that the assertion is correct. Using CaliMod for VMT modeling would result in a regional average trip being applied. CaliMod simply looks at the project and the mitigation of the project and what VMT the project is likely to generate and what reduction in that VMT is likely to occur as a result of the mitigation measures. It's not correct that using CaliMod results in a regional average trip being applied. I'm not actually quite sure exactly what that means. But in any case, if we're trying to achieve a 15% reduction, no, you can show that in many, many cases using CaliMod. I've actually done some, these are urban case studies, but in any case, you can use CaliMod to show a VMT reduction of that amount. That would not lead to every project going to an EIR if not screened out. Okay.
All right. You ready for our next question?
Yeah, let's go on.
All right. Do you have any guidance for setting thresholds, looking at VMT for projects that support rural parks and open space lands? Examples include new trails and parking lots to serve trails.
Right. We don't provide any guidance on open space land uses like parks, but this time is to think through some of those options. So generally we recommend when looking at a land use other than the ones we provide guidance for, residential, office, and retail are what we have guidance for as far as land uses. There's kind of two general approaches. There's the one we have for residential and office, which is looking at, for residential, it's per capita VMT, and for office, it's per employee VMT, and comparing those to regional averages. And more specifically, we recommend in urban areas, comparing to regional average minus 15% or 85% of regional average VMT per employee or VMT per capita. For retail, and I spoke about this briefly, we recommend looking at the VMT with the project and the VMT without the project. On first blush, I would look into the latter approach, the one we recommend for retail. So if you, say, improved an open space into a park, would that draw people into more driving for their recreation needs, or would it provide people a closer destination for recreation, physical activity, et cetera, than they had before, and thereby reduce VMT? And then think about the threshold of how much VMT grows. In urban areas, we recommend if the project increases VMT for retail, I would recommend considering that might be significant. But in rural areas, you could think about whether that's an appropriate threshold. But yeah, the general question of whether the project increases the amount of driving for the purpose of that the project serves, in this case, recreation, exercise, et cetera. Will, I think you're muted again. I still haven't learned to read lips, unfortunately.
All right, I am now unmuted. My apologies. Our closest Trader Joe's is 3 hours or 150 miles away. The next closest is 4 hours or 200 miles away. Locating one in our town would both capture leakage and will also be a regional draw. presumably up to half the distance or time. However, the rural lifestyle supports that those traveling from rural areas make multiple stops on each trip to the town center. How does one make the differentiation work?
Okay, I think that I understand this question. I'm going to do my best to answer it. So it sounds like the questioner is cognizant that supplying a store, in this case a Trader Joe's, is both going to allow a lot of people to make shorter trips to Trader Joe's. They're not going to have to go to that Trader Joe's 3 hours away. They would just be able to go to this closer Trader Joe's, but also might draw people in from a distance, right? So there's, from the next town or 2 towns over, maybe 50 miles away or 20 miles away, I'm just guessing. So the analysis would look at which of those 2 factors dominates, right? You're going to have some people reducing their trip length, reducing their shopping VMT, and other people increasing their shopping VMT. So the question is, what's the net effect? So that's, I also see that there's a reference to trip chaining, to people making multiple retail stops along the along their shopping trip, their shopping tour, and that of course helps reduce VMT as well. So that should be included in the analysis. I think that answered that question. Please feel free to chime back in if that didn't give a full answer.
All right. All right, our next question is, I would like to have our TDM update draft thresholds of significance and screening criteria reviewed by OPR for consistency with SB 743 and associated guidance before presenting it to our Board of Supervisors and City Council for adoption. Who should I send it to at OPR, and what is the email address?
Okay, so first off, I'll offer you my email address, and I'm happy to take a look over your work. But please don't mistake that for that OPR is reviewing approaches in 743. OPR has never been in the position of, or had the authority to, or had any sort of requirement for review of approaches on CEQA impact categories, and 743 is no different. These are lead agency prerogative, and we're happy to provide some thinking. We have done that for some other jurisdictions. It's a little bit tougher now because we're in the last month or so before implementation. So if everyone were to reach out and say, would you look at ours? It just wouldn't be possible due to capacity. But I would welcome you to send what you have to your approach to me, and I will give it my best shot at reviewing. My email address is chris.ganson, just first name dot last, at opr.ca.gov. You can also submit, we'll give you a question. Please don't send all of your questions to me. We have a question. In fact, I'll just put it up right now. It's premature because it says thanks, and I don't mean to say we're wrapping up, but I just want to get this email up. I'll keep this up for a few minutes and then go back so you can see the resources page on our website, and you can see the questions email, which you can send additional questions to. I'll leave this up as we take the next question, and then I'll go back to our prettier screen. Well,
sorry, this slide isn't as pretty.
Oh, it's nice. It's just it doesn't have
it's not Nevada City, it's just,
yeah, no, it's not a critique of your artistry here. Slide 2.
Our next question is for non-urban areas. Instead of looking at the average VMT per capita for the city for regional and average VMT per employee for the entire region, which might include large urban areas, would it be acceptable to look at average VMT for a council of governments area? So larger area than the city, but smaller than, say, a county?
So again, this looks like a question that's for what we would categorize as an urban area rather than a rural area. But our recommendation is to look at either regional for residential, I'm talking now, either regional or city VMT per capita. And the reason for that is that um, generally, so for office development, we recommend solely looking at regional because people tend to travel over in metropolitan areas. People tend to um, I'll put it in a little more technical term. The region tends to be the travel shed, the area over which people typically in their day travel. So if you are looking at a smaller or drawing the line, perhaps strategically around a higher VMT area to get a more permissive threshold, then we lose connection to state climate goals and that connection to the different places in residential people may have lived in order to and do their commuting in a region. So yeah, in urban areas that would be outside of our recommendations. We recommend basing either for residential and city or regional VMT per capita and regional VMT per employee for office.
Our next question is, what are some examples of streamlined projects? And does a list of such projects need to be adopted by our jurisdiction before calling them streamlined?
So I'm going to actually refer this one back to our technical advisory and our webinar. We have a bunch of information on streamlining in there, and I don't want to try and go through it all just for time right now. But there are a bunch of pathways, and that's one of the things we really like about VMT. We're a state that needs to streamline, for example, a lot of housing. The VMT metric allows a lot of housing to be streamlined, probably half or more of overall state future housing development. So yeah, take a look at our technical advisory. Take a look at the webinar. There's a whole section on streamlining in that as well. If you choose the webinar, the second or third webinar, it's right in the front section. So in the first 20 minutes or half hour of my talk, which is in the first 30 or 40 minutes of the overall webinar, you can scroll around to get to it.
All right. Sutter County typically processes small projects, including divisions of agricultural land into 20, 40, or 80 acre increments, or separating a single 3-acre home site parcel from a parent agricultural parcel in compliance with the general plan. How do you mitigate VMT for small projects such as these?
So the project may be small enough that it fits under our small projects screening, which is a project that generates 110 trips per day, which is probably roughly equivalent of 10 or 11 roughly residential units. So if the project is, it looks like we're looking at 3-acre home site parcel, so that's going to, I assume, have a single house on it. That would not, that would be screened as presumed less than significant. So let me see if there's another piece to this question I need to address. I think that addressed that. You're generally, that looks like if we're looking at parcels with a single house on them, or even a couple few houses on them, it's just not going to rise to the level of needing analysis under CEQA under our recommendations.
All right, it's another screening question. Are screening thresholds like the ones proposed in the technical advisory considered thresholds of significance? Would we have to adopt screening criteria via ordinance or resolution? Is this something that we should refer to a previous webinar?
No, I can answer this directly. So screening criteria, not thresholds, but they're based on the threshold. Screening is just simply a shortcut, a very easy way to show that your development is quite likely to be below the threshold. And so likely enough that you don't even need to do the analysis. You can simply point to the screening factor and say, okay, we don't need to do analysis. Did I finish answering that question? Screening, okay, here it is. The technical screening thresholds like the one proposed in the technical advisory considered thresholds of significance. So screening thresholds are based on thresholds of significance. They're basically where the project would exhibit below the threshold of significance VMT. Exhibit VMT below the threshold of significance. I think that answered that one. And the other piece, you don't need to adopt that via ordinance or resolution. It's simply substantial evidence that we've provided, and you can just point to. And you can do that on a project by project basis. You don't need to do it by ordinance or resolution.
All right, our next question. If an agency can provide evidence, would it be acceptable or recommended to adopt reducing thresholds below 15%?
Simply put, in rural areas, I think the answer is generally yes. I would have concerns about doing so in urban areas since there is such strong substantial evidence for that 15% number already in existence.
All right, we're down to 6 questions and we still have about 19 minutes. So just throwing that out there, we may wrap up a little early if there are no more questions. The next question is, would a city of 10,000 population that is within an agricultural area and on which many of the residents depend on for employment be considered rural? And there's a second part to the question. How would you approach crafting a VMT threshold for CEQA for such a community? So many of the VMT reduction measures are not applicable to or financially feasible within a rural area. This begs the question about whether OPR's recommended thresholds can or should be relaxed.
Right. So again, we provide those thresholds specifically for urban areas, by which we mean MPO areas, and the rural counties, we recommend developing thresholds on a case-by-case basis. We agree that in some cases that approach for some projects is not going to be appropriate. And employment be considered rural. So our recommendations designate rural in non-MPO as non-MPO counties areas, and I also mentioned that we are working with Caltrans to look into whether we should develop some sort of designation for areas in MPO counties which are truly rural and would be expected to stay rural indefinitely, and may be able to provide some guidance in the future on those.
Great. How would you recommend applying VMT to a school that only wishes to increase daily trips without an addition of students or construction or development above the 110 limit recommended by OPR's technical advisory for small projects? Would a school project to increase daily trips be exempt under 14 California Civil CCR? I'm probably messing up that acronym, 15314.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. School project, would a school project increase daily trips be exempt? So let's think about the kind of 2 approaches that we have in our recommendations. One for residential and office, where you're looking at the trips generated by the use and comparing those to the average in the, in many cases in the region, and the approach for retail. So how would I recommend applying VMT to a school that only wishes to increase daily trips without an addition of students or construction development? So you might apply, and if I understand this question correctly, you might apply the approach that we use for retail, which is looking at the total amount of vehicle travel with and without the project. And if the project is not going to add any vehicle travel, then it's not going to have a significant impact. So that's one approach. Again, you can also, you also for schools might use the other approach, which is looking at the VMT, in this case, perhaps per student, and seeing how it compares to other, um, uh, to VMT per student of other schools across the county. That might be the kind of approach you'd use. So a couple options there.
All right. Does OPR have any plans to assist rural counties and communities with guidance on VMT thresholds? We are usually the areas with less staff and resources to perform our own analysis compared to urban cities.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and we get that. So what we probably can't do, well, I'm sure we can't do, we recommend developing thresholds on a case-by-case basis because we think in rural areas they need to be developed on a case-by-case basis. So that actually just means that we can't develop guidance for doing it because guidance is, for rural areas generally. It doesn't work because of that case-by-case, the need to do that on a case-by-case basis. That said, we can supplement this webinar. Again, it's the tricky part is that we're in the last month here, and we have there's just a few of us. But that said, we're happy to help out in any way we can. If you want to have a conversation, feel free to reach out to us, and we will do our best to schedule one and work through questions you have on thresholds specific to your community for various project types. Again, you may not need to come up with a single kind of grand unified threshold. It may make sense to do it on a more project by project basis. So there may not need to be, the nice side of that is there may not need to be upfront work for you to do in establishing those ahead of time.
Our next question is, in sparsely populated areas with small or flat-lined levels of growth, how might the concept of thresholds based on fair share portions of statewide allowances apply? Would screening out projects that add only minuscule amounts of VMT growth, far less than, say, 6.5% of VMT growth over the 2050 horizon, be allowable?
Mm-hmm. So if you look at state climate goals, you see that we can increase our VMT, not as much as we're on trajectory to increasing, but we can increase it by some, and that number is 6.5% according to the most recent calculations, in an absolute sense. This is different from the 15% VMT per capita. So if you do a statewide analysis, which CARB did, and showed, it shows that again, we can grow our VMT by 6.5% and still hit our climate goals. And in order to do that, we would need to, across the state generally, that's the basis of a recommendation for urban areas, we would need to, new development would need to be 15% more efficient than existing development on average. So that's just to explain why 6.5% and 15% are the same, are crosswalked from the same data. Where there's not much growth, so there's going to be, I guess the first question here is, if there's not much growth, I guess there is a little growth because there's not reasons to, the projects are accommodating somebody. I guess this gets at, if you were to assume that 6.5% growth in VMT, that a rural low growth county got a share of it, how would you assess what that share is? Would you assess that they get that VMT because of their existing population? Or would you assess that they get that VMT, get that growth in VMT because of their growth in population? And depending on which you choose, you'd get a lot different kind of amount of VMT to work with. So that's a first question to ponder. If you are taking a 6.5% growth, even though you're not growing population, is that other jurisdiction in California that is increasing in population by a much larger amount, do they also only get 6.5%? And they have to crank down their VMT thresholds quite a bit more. So that fair share question, we have, we've attempted to answer it for urban areas, and it's true that we haven't attempted to answer it for rural areas for the reasons I've described a few times now. Now, I would say, taking a big step back, that fair share threshold, or fair share, sorry, approach in creating a threshold might be a good way of developing a threshold, but I would think carefully about how, what is the fair share across different jurisdictions, counties, whatever, across the state, and then how that is used over time. So if you're burning through your fair share, the fair share is through 2050, and you're burning through it in year 2, is that really a fair share? Have you really developed a fair share? So those are the kind of cautions I would float, but the general approach may well have some real merit.
All right. And I want to pardon my device for making a flippant remark during your eloquent response, Chris.
I couldn't hear it, actually.
These are the work from home issues we have when your devices are talking to you and you're not talking to them. Our next question, we have 3 remaining questions in about 9 minutes. So that's probably going to take us to the end of the hour. Does this, well, 4 questions now. Does the state have a definition of rural area or rural county? I haven't been able to find one. That term seems to be tossed around loosely.
Yes, this is a good quick one. For purposes of 743, we define rural areas as rural counties, non-MPO counties, and non-rural counties as MPO counties. So that's actually a clear distinction we've drawn.
Great.
I'll stop there so we can try and get to these next ones.
All right, this question is built on a previous question. I don't know if we're going to remember. By fixed, do you mean that it does not need to be revised to include VMT for traffic? But I don't know what that's referring to.
I might need a little more context. By fixed.
Yeah, Megan Starr, if you're still on with us, go ahead and resubmit.
Yeah, give us a little more context, and we'll try and get to it before the end.
Laura asks, following up on the COG or Council of Governments question, we are using the SCAG regional travel demand model. If trips in and out of the Council of Governments go as far as the SCAG region allows, then Council of Governments trips are not truncated. Therefore, using the Council of Governments to establish thresholds should be okay, right?
So, okay, there's 2 issues here. One is whether trips are truncated, meaning that they're cut off at the end of a model. If you use a travel demand model, that travel demand model models for a certain area. If a trip goes beyond it and you don't do something to account for that, the trip is truncated. There's a lot of ways to solve that. SACOG is working on a fairly detailed one right now, but there's also, you could use simpler back of the envelope approaches as well. And I described that either last week or in the webinar, I forget which. Won't go into that now for time. And then there's the question of your reference geography for establishing your thresholds. And if you're in an urban area, again, our recommendation is to use either the regional, the region as your basis, or the city as your basis. I would add, if you're in an unincorporated county area, we also recommend that you can use either the region or the the weighted average of all the cities in the region. We don't recommend using the carving the cities out and looking at the unincorporated county, because that's simply carving the low VMT areas out, and just it seems too much like you're carving low VMT areas out to create a more permissive threshold. So we don't recommend doing that.
All right, our next question is, and it may be our last question, if a trip-based approach to calculating VMT is applied to a school project, would that number be compared to the regional average of daily VMT for office or school use? We lack data to compare only our schools within the region.
Yeah, data availability is sometimes is what guides your choice of method. Obviously, you don't want to use a method for which data is not available. So if you don't have data to compare schools, then you probably don't want to use that approach. Then you might want to use the approach where you look and see whether developing the school increases or decreases VMT and judge your impact that way.
Is that a wrap for that question, Chris?
Let me just look really quickly. Would that number be compared to the regional average of daily V? So, oh yeah, no, there is one more thing I want to say in response, which is that no, we wouldn't recommend comparing your VMT per capita or VMT per, in this case, maybe student, to office or residential uses. That would be kind of mixing apples and oranges. We would recommend comparing to other school uses. Generally, in what we've recommended and how you operationalize 743, we recommend comparing uses to like uses because what we're trying to do is not develop one use more than another. That's not the intention of 743, just as the intention is not to limit growth. The intention is to show the efficiency of growth. So how efficient is this this residential development compared to residential developments generally? And you could do the same with schools. Again, if you don't have the data, then that may not be an option for you.
All right, it looks like with 4 minutes left, we are out of questions. I guess we can use the next few minutes to give acknowledgements to yourself for tackling another office hours without a break for 2 hours straight, answering questions without any like prompts or, I mean, with some supporting analysis from Jeannie Lee, our chief counsel. But I want to give both.
Sorry to cut you off. I just want to let you know that I did respond to the person who asked that question about fixed, and it was in relation to something that I had typed in to the Q&A portion. So I just clarified for the commenter, it was a question about in-process documents, and I had just clarified that if your document, let's say you put out a draft EIR today, and it meets the content requirements of CEQA today, then after July 1st, you don't need to update your CEQA document before you finalize it. You don't need to update it with VMT after July 1st if your document, let's say it's put out for public review today and it meets all the requirements.
Okay, thanks for tying up that loose end, Jeannie.
Yeah. And I had saw that you tied that up, Jeannie. That's hence my acknowledgement. You're on top of it. You're both a powerful duo, and I'm very happy to join your duo. I also want to acknowledge Alyssa Montanez. She is our tech savvy tech support for today. Without her assistance, this would not be streaming live to YouTube, and you wouldn't see our beautiful faces and nameplates in place of our faces. So thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Jeannie. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, participants. At one point, we were at 176 participants. So it must mean that we're getting the word out. We've still got capacity. So if you know folks that are struggling and have questions about future office hour topics we'll be talking about in coming weeks, tiering, that is on June 10th. It's escaping me what's on June 3rd right now. I'm pulling that up.
June 3rd is the projects, and we've talked about it a lot here today, but projects other than the ones we provide recommendations for. So what do you do with industrial projects? What do you do with schools? That sort of thing. It'll be a lot like this, and that we'll be talking through. We don't have recommendations out for it because there's just too many land uses to provide detailed recommendations, but we'll talk through ideas as we've done today.
Great. So definitely share it with your networks. For more details on all of this, check out opr.ca.gov. That's where you'll find our YouTube channel, our SB 743 pages, and other information that you can all consume. So thank you again for joining us for office hours. We will see you next week, June 3rd at 10 a.m.